You don't realize you've been stood up all at once. It happens in slow, humiliating degrees. The ice in your water glass melts into a tepid puddle. The barista strictly avoids your gaze. Then, you calculate the babysitter's hourly rate, realizing you just paid $30 to sit entirely alone. The cafe smelled like burnt espresso and wet wool. Dakota traced the condensation dripping down the side of her glass, watching a single drop track through the smudged fingerprint she'd left a minute ago. It was 2:47 p.m. Greg was supposed to be here at 2:15. She wasn't heartbroken. That was the most pathetic part. Heartbreak required a baseline of hope, and Dakota's hope had been ground down to a fine, cynical powder somewhere around her son's third ear infection last winter. No, she wasn't heartbroken. She was irritated. She was bone-deep, marrow-heavy tired, and fundamentally furious at the waste of time. Time was a currency she didn't have to spare. Back at her cramped apartment, Mrs. Higgins, the neighbor who smelled faintly of mothballs and peppermint schnapps, was charging her $15 an hour to watch 4-year-old Leo. Dakota had budgeted for exactly 2 hours. Enough time for a coffee, a forced conversation about where you see yourself in 5 years, and a brisk walk back to the bus stop. Instead, she was sitting at a sticky faux wood table near the restroom, wearing a dark green silk blouse she'd spent 20 minutes steaming, feeling the damp chill of the Seattle autumn seep through the soles of her boots. She unlocked her phone. The screen was cracked in the top left corner, a spider web of shattered glass that caught the cafe's harsh overhead track lighting. Dakota. I'm at the table near the back. No rush. Sent at 2:10 p.m. Dakota. Everything okay? Sent at 2:30 p.m. Beneath the second message, the little gray text simply read, Read 2:32 p.m. A ghosting in real time. She let the phone drop onto the table with a dull thud. Across the room, the espresso machine hissed angrily, releasing a cloud of steam that smelled heavily of scalded milk. Dakota pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. The urge to cry was there, but it wasn't a romantic grief. It was the raw, hot frustration of a mother who had skipped lunch to afford this outing, who had shaved her legs for a man who couldn't even manage the basic human decency of a cancellation text. She looked at her untouched latte. The foam had collapsed into a beige, pockmarked film. It looked exactly how she felt. Deflated, stale, left out too long. A couple at the window table laughed, the woman leaning over to touch the man's wrist. Dakota watched them with a detached, clinical envy. She remembered when dating felt like a discovery rather than a high-stakes job interview, where she was terrified they'd find out she came with baggage, a single mom. In the dating world, that was often treated like a pre-existing condition nobody wanted to underwrite. Greg's profile had said he loved kids. Proud uncle, his bio had boasted, right next to a picture of him holding up a violently large fish. She should have known better. Uncles get to hand the kids back when they cry, when they throw up, when the electric bill is due, and the toddler needs new winter boots on the same damn day. Dakota gathered her purse, a battered leather tote that doubled as a diaper bag in a pinch. She checked for the pacifier she kept in the side pocket out of sheer reflex, her thumb brushing the worn silicone. She needed to leave. If she left now, she'd only owe Mrs. Higgins $30. She stood up, pulling her thrifted wool coat off the back of the chair. It was slightly too tight across the shoulders, a rigid, scratchy reminder that she hadn't bought new clothes for herself since before Leo was born. As she slid her arm into the sleeve, the brass bell above the cafe door didn't just chime. it violently clattered against the glass. The door banged open, letting in a gust of freezing, rain-heavy wind that sent napkins fluttering across the condiment station. And then, the quiet, melancholic atmosphere of the cafe was entirely, utterly destroyed. It wasn't just a man entering. It was a localized natural disaster. He came through the door backward, his shoulder wedged against the heavy glass to keep it open, while he tried to maneuver a side-by-side double stroller over the raised threshold. But that was only half the problem. Tethered to his free hand by brightly colored, coiled wrist leashes were two more children, walking, or rather violently resisting walking, on their own feet. They looked to be about 3 years old, a matched set of absolute chaos. Dakota froze, one arm in her coat, instinctively assessing the threat level. The man heaved the stroller inside, the wheels squeaking loudly against the wet linoleum. The two in the stroller were shrieking in perfect, ear-splitting harmony, their small fists beating against the plastic trays. The two on the leashes were moving in opposite directions. One, a boy in a bright yellow raincoat, was trying to sit down in a puddle of dirty rainwater by the door. The other, a girl with a missing shoe, was actively trying to chew through the nylon strap binding her to the man's wrist. The cafe went dead silent, save for the screaming children. Every patron, every barista stopped and stared with that specific, icy brand of judgment reserved for parents failing in public. Dakota didn't judge. She felt a sudden, visceral phantom pain in her lower back just watching him. The man finally got the door closed. He turned around and Dakota caught her breath, not from attraction, but from the sheer juxtaposition of him. He was wearing a suit, not a mid-level management suit, but the kind of tailored dark charcoal wool that draped perfectly, catching the light in a way that screamed custom-made. His shoes were Italian leather, sleek and aggressively expensive. His watch caught the glare of the track lighting, a heavy matte black chunk of metal that probably cost more than Dakota's college debt. But he looked like he had been dragged behind a truck. His tie was gone. The top 3 buttons of his crisp white shirt ripped open. There was a smear of what looked definitively like mashed sweet potato across his left lapel. His dark hair was entirely disheveled, sticking up in tufts where small, sticky hands had clearly been pulling at it, and his eyes. Dakota stared at his face. He had the hollowed-out, 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who had been in the trenches for 3 days straight. He looked at the long line for the counter, at the judgmental faces of the college students and freelancers tapping on laptops, and Dakota watched the last remaining shred of his soul leave his body. "Okay," the man muttered, his voice raspy and desperate. "Okay, guys, we're inside. It's warm. Stop. Please stop." He spoke to them like they were rational adults who had temporarily lost their minds. A rookie mistake Dakota recognized immediately. "Want juice," screamed the boy in the stroller, kicking his rain boots against the footrest. "I know, buddy, I know. We're getting juice," the man said, trying to untangle the leash of the floor-sitting boy from his own legs. "Finn, get up. The floor's dirty. Chloe, stop eating the leash. It's not food." He was wealthy. Stinking, filthy, wealthy. It radiated off him in the cut of his clothes and the perfect straight line of his jaw. Yet money couldn't buy a pause button on a 3-year-old. It couldn't buy dignity when you were wrestling 4 toddlers in a cramped, judgmental coffee shop. Dakota watched, her own misery momentarily eclipsed by the spectacular train wreck unfolding 20 feet away. He managed to drag the entire screaming entourage toward a large round table near the center of the room. It was a terrible tactical choice. Too exposed. No wall to pin them against. Dakota shook her head slightly. Rookie. He unbuckled the stroller and the chaos multiplied. It was like watching a clown car empty out. But the clowns were heavily armed and furious. Suddenly, there were 4 identical faces. Tousled brown curls, flushed cheeks, and manic energy, swarming the table. Sit in the chairs, the man begged, grabbing a chair with one hand, while trying to catch a fleeing Finn with the other. Ruby, do not touch the sugar packets. A heavy glass sugar dispenser shattered against the floor. The sound was sharp, cutting through the din. The barista at the counter flinched. A woman in a beret actually scoffed loudly, packing up her laptop with exaggerated, angry movements. The man froze, looking down at the glittering pile of glass and white sugar. His shoulders slumped. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a slow, agonizing deflation. He didn't look mad at the child. He looked utterly defeated. He crouched down, ignoring his expensive slacks dragging in the wet grime of the floor, and started trying to push the glass into a pile with his bare hands. Dakota stood entirely still by her table near the restroom. Her hand tightened on the strap of her purse. The cynical, exhausted part of her brain, the part that was out $30 on a Sunday afternoon, screamed at her to walk out the door. Not your circus, not your monkeys. You have your own kid. You have your own problems. But then the boy, Finn, the floor sitter, spotted an escape route. While his father was distracted by the broken glass and his 3 siblings were busy dismantling the napkin holder, Finn locked eyes on the hallway leading to the restrooms, where Dakota was standing. He didn't walk. He sprinted, a tiny chaotic missile in a yellow raincoat, straight toward Dakota's legs. Dakota didn't think. The maternal reflex bypassed her brain entirely, operating on pure muscle memory. As the boy barreled past her table, heading for the swinging door of the men's room, Dakota simply reached out and hooked 2 fingers firmly through the back loop of his raincoat hood. Finn jerked to a halt, his little boots slipping on the linoleum. He dangled there for a second, looking back at her with wide, indignant brown eyes. "No bathroom runs on a solo mission, buddy," Dakota said, her voice dropping into that flat, authoritative tone she used when Leo tried to eat cat food. Back at the center table, the man stood up sharply, holding a handful of sugar and glass shards. He looked around wildly, panic sparking in his eyes when he realized he was short 1 kid. "Finn!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Got him!" Dakota called out, not loudly, but with enough projection to cut through the cafe chatter. She turned the boy around by his shoulders. Up close, he smelled like damp rubber and graham crackers. He was sticky. Children this age were perpetually, inexplicably sticky. She held his small, slightly grubby hand in hers and walked him the 20 feet back to the disaster zone. The man stared at her as she approached. Up close, his exhaustion was even more profound. He had dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, and a faint shadow of stubble that suggested he hadn't slept, let alone shaved, in a few days. "Thank you," he breathed out, dumping the broken glass onto a spare napkin on the table. He looked at Finn. "Don't run off, please. Dad is begging you." "You need to box them in," Dakota said. She didn't mean to offer advice. It just slipped out, a tactical assessment from one trench soldier to another. The man blinked at her, confused. "What?" "The table." Dakota pointed to a booth in the far corner, currently occupied by a teenager reading a comic book. Round tables are a 360-degree perimeter. You can't defend it. You need a booth. Pin them against the wall. You act as the human barricade on the outside edge. It cuts their escape routes by 70%. He stared at her. He looked at the round table. He looked at the booth. Then he looked back at Dakota, his eyes scanning her face. She was aware suddenly of how she must look. A woman in a wrinkled thrift store blouse, holding her coat, staring down a billionaire like she was a drill sergeant. Before he could respond, the girl with the missing shoe, Chloe, reached across the table and swiped her hand through the spilled sugar, bringing a fistful of it to her mouth. "No!" the man gasped, lunging forward, but he was too late. Chloe crunched down, her face immediately contorting in a mixture of delight and horror as a shard of sugar-coated glass undoubtedly got dangerously close to her tongue. Dakota didn't wait for him to panic. She dropped her purse. She stepped past the man, invading his personal space, smelling a wave of expensive sandalwood cologne mixed with baby wipes. She clamped her fingers gently but firmly on the hinges of Chloe's jaw. "Open," Dakota commanded, not yelling, just completely immovable. Chloe, startled by the strange woman, opened her mouth. Dakota swept her index finger quickly through the child's cheek, hooking the large, unswallowed chunk of glass and wet sugar, and pulled it out. She wiped it onto the napkin with the rest of the debris. "Spit the rest out, honey. Now," Dakota said. Holding her cupped hand under the girl's chin, Chloe spat. It was gross. It was wet, sandy, and completely undignified. Dakota wiped her hand on her own jeans without a second thought. The man was staring at her, chest heaving, his face pale. Is she cut?" "No blood," Dakota said practically, inspecting the girl's mouth. "Just sugar. But you need to get a wet rag from the barista to wipe this table down before they snort it." He looked at Dakota like she had just performed a miracle. I'm Hayes," he said, his voice bewildered. "Dakota," she replied curtly. She bent down to pick up her purse. Her duty as a good Samaritan was over. She was tired, she was out $30, and Greg was still a ghost. "Good luck with the quad squad, Hayes." She turned to walk away. "Wait," Hayes said, his voice sharper this time, a flash of the authority that probably ran boardrooms slipping through the exhaustion. Dakota paused, looking back over her shoulder. He was wiping his sugary hands on his expensive trousers, wincing as the toddler in the stroller began to scream for juice again. Did you just say quad squad?" "4 kids. Identical age, identical faces. Quadruplets," Dakota said, gesturing to the chaos. "Unless you just collect 3-year-olds for sport, which is a weird hobby." A short, rusty sound punched out of his chest. It took Dakota a second to realize it was a laugh. It sounded like he hadn't used it in a very long time. "I don't. They're mine," he said. He looked at the floor, then at Dakota's table by the restroom. He saw the single collapsed latte, the melted water, the obvious signs of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone who wasn't coming. "Are you leaving?" he asked. "Yes," Dakota said, defensive instinct flaring. She didn't need pity from a man whose shoes cost her rent. "My appointment fell through." "Appointment," he repeated softly, reading between the lines of her stiff posture and the slightly too fancy green blouse. He looked back at his own screaming children. Ruby was currently trying to put a sugar packet up her nose. Hayes reached out and caught Ruby's wrist gently. He looked at Dakota, his dark eyes dropping the facade of polite society. "Dakota," he said, the name sounding strange and heavy in his mouth. "I have no idea what I'm doing. My nanny quit this morning, completely walked out. I haven't been alone with them in public, ever. If you walk out that door, I'm fairly certain one of them will set something on fire." "They're 3. They lack the motor skills for arson," Dakota replied dryly. "Please." It was the tone of the word that stopped her. It wasn't an order from a rich man. It was the desperate, cracked plea of a drowning parent. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, heavy black metal credit card. He tossed it onto the table beside the broken sugar dispenser. "I will buy you whatever you want. Coffee, pastries, the entire display case," Hayes said, his voice dropping so the nosy people at the next table couldn't hear. "I'll pay you whatever your hourly rate at work is. Just sit with me for 20 minutes until my sister gets here to help me wrangle them."
Dakota looked at the black card. She thought about Mrs. Higgins. She thought about Greg, who couldn't even text her back. She looked at Hayes, a man drowning in his own bespoke suit, holding a crying toddler while another chewed on his shoelaces. It was a terrible idea. She wanted to go home, take off her bra, and eat leftover macaroni with Leo. But her feet hurt. She was furious at the universe. And this man was offering her free caffeine and a front row seat to a disaster that wasn't hers.
Dakota sighed, a long, cynical exhalation. She walked back to her table, grabbed her cold, dead latte, and carried it over to the war zone. "Move," she said to Hayes, nudging his shoulder. He blinked, then hurriedly scrambled out of the way, dragging a chair over for her. Dakota sat down right in the middle of the chaos. She looked at the 4 toddlers who had temporarily stopped crying to stare at the new stranger in their midst. "I don't want your money," Dakota said to Hayes, pulling a pack of baby wipes out of her tote bag with the swift, practiced motion of a gunslinger drawing a weapon. She slapped it onto the table. "But you're buying me a double espresso, a warm chocolate croissant, and you're going to tell me exactly what you did to make your nanny walk out on a Sunday." Hayes slumped into the chair beside her, looking at the baby wipes like they were solid gold. "Deal," he breathed. Opening hook. She thought she was just an exhausted single mother being ghosted on a pathetic Sunday afternoon date. She didn't know her tactical military training was about to be deployed inside a coffee shop, or the taming of Billionaire's 4 screaming toddlers would completely rewrite the rest of her entire life. The barista approached their table like a bomb technician approaching a suspicious package. He slid a tray onto the small sliver of unoccupied table space, his eyes darting between the 4 children. He set down a double espresso, a warmed chocolate croissant on a ceramic plate, and 4 plastic cups of apple juice with tight lids and flexible straws. He didn't say a word. He just backed away slowly. Dakota pulled her espresso closer. The ceramic cup was thick and hot against her palms. She took a sip. It was bitter, overly roasted, and exactly what she needed. "Napkins," Dakota said, not looking at Hayes. She pointed at the center of the table. "Create a barrier between the juice and the edge of the table. They're going to swat at the cups. It's a spatial awareness issue. Their gross motor skills outpace their judgment." Hayes didn't question her. He just grabbed a thick stack of brown paper napkins and began building a small, absorbent dam around the 4 plastic cups. His movements were jerky, the fine tremors of a man running entirely on adrenaline and caffeine withdrawal. He smelled like expensive wool, fear sweat, and something inherently metallic. The scent of a boardroom executive who hadn't slept in 72 hours. "You didn't answer my question," Dakota said. She picked up the croissant, tearing a piece off. The pastry was warm, the butter leaving a greasy sheen on her fingertips. "What did you do to the nanny?" Hayes let out a long, ragged exhale. He dragged a hand down his face, the stubble scraping audibly against his palm. "I didn't do anything. My schedule did. My life did. I was supposed to be home by 6 yesterday. I walked in at 3 this morning. She was sitting in the dark in the kitchen. She slid her keys across the island, told me she wasn't a surrogate mother, and walked out. He looked at the kids. Finn and Ruby were currently engaged in a silent, violent tug-of-war over a single flexible straw, despite both having their own. Chloe was staring blankly at the ceiling, humming a low, vibrating note. The fourth one, Dakota hadn't caught his name yet, was systematically peeling the label off his juice cup with terrifying focus. I offered to triple her salary, Hayes muttered, leaning his elbows on the table. He looked at Dakota, his eyes bloodshot and entirely devoid of ego. I threw money at her. It's what I do. It's what I'm good at. She just laughed. She said money doesn't buy sleep. Dakota chewed her croissant slowly. The chocolate was cheap, overly sweet against the harsh espresso, but she was starving. She swallowed, feeling a sharp pang of empathy that she actively tried to suppress. Empathy was dangerous. It made you volunteer for things. It made you stay. She's right, Dakota said bluntly. You can't buy sleep, and you can't outsource the physical presence of a parent forever. Eventually, the check bounces emotionally. Hayes flinched. It was microscopic movement, a tightening of his jaw. But Dakota caught it. She was trained to catch it. In her previous life, before she traded Kevlar for spit-up rags, noticing the minute shifts in a person's posture kept her squad alive in the hostile, dusty streets of Kandahar. She had spent 5 years managing supply chains and tactical logistics in active war zones. She knew how to read a room, and she knew how to read a man pushed to his absolute breaking point. Hayes was currently operating in the red zone. Where is their mother? Dakota asked. It was an invasive question, but social niceties felt irrelevant over the screaming of 4 toddlers. Hayes stared at the paper napkin dam. Gone, he said. The word dropped onto the table, heavy and final. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The total absence of warmth in his voice, the sheer crushing weight of the single syllable, told Dakota everything. It wasn't a divorce. It was a permanent exit. Dakota felt a sour taste in her mouth that had nothing to do with the espresso. She reached across the table and firmly separated Finn and Ruby's hands, taking the disputed straw and snapping it cleanly in half. She handed one piece to each child. They stared at the shortened straws, too confused to cry. I have one, Dakota said quietly, wiping her buttery fingers on a wipe. Leo, he's 4. His dad decided that the reality of a crying infant was significantly less appealing than his freedom. He moved to Denver when Leo was 3 months old. I haven't seen a dime of child support or a birthday card since. Hayes looked at her, really looked at her. He took in the faded green silk of her blouse, the way her hair was pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense knot, the rigid, exhausted line of her shoulders. You're doing it alone, Hayes said. It wasn't a question. I'm doing it, Dakota corrected flatly. Alone is just a modifier. The job gets done regardless. How? Hayes asked, his voice cracking slightly. He leaned closer, ignoring Chloe, who was now tapping her sticky hands against his suit jacket. How do you do it? I have a staff of 3, a personal assistant, and a corner office overlooking the bay. I manage billion-dollar acquisitions. And right now, I am entirely paralyzed by the prospect of getting these 4 human beings from this table to my SUV. Dakota studied him. He was pathetic, but he was honest. He wasn't trying to hide his incompetence behind his wealth. He was simply drowning. You manage them like a hostile environment, Dakota said, slipping easily into the cold, clinical vocabulary she used to rely on. You establish a perimeter. You secure your supply lines. You never move without a contingency plan. Right now, your perimeter is compromised. You brought 4 unpredictable hostiles into a civilian zone without backup. That was your first mistake. Hayes stared at her, utterly baffled. Hostiles? There are 3, Dakota said, pointing to the boy peeling the label. What's his name? Oliver, Hayes whispered. Oliver is currently assessing the structural integrity of that plastic cup, Dakota noted, her eyes tracking the boy's sharp fingernails. In approximately 40 seconds, he is going to puncture it, and you will have 8 ounces of sticky apple juice all over your Italian leather shoes. Hayes grabbed the cup from Oliver just as the plastic gave a sickening crunch. Oliver immediately threw his head back and unleashed a wail that rattled the pastry case. Pacifier, Dakota commanded. Hayes scrambled, patting down his pockets frantically. I don't think I brought them. Dakota sighed, a long, rough sound. She unzipped her battered leather tote bag. She dug past a spare diaper, a crumpled receipt from the grocery store, and a slightly bruised apple, pulling out a small sealed plastic container. Inside were 2 sterile pacifiers she kept as emergency backups for Leo. She popped the lid off, took one out, and swiftly plugged it into Oliver's screaming mouth. The silence was instant and deafening. Oliver sucked furiously on the silicone, his brown eyes wide, tears still trapped in his lashes. Hayes stared at Dakota's tote bag like it was the Holy Grail. "Are you Mary Poppins?" he asked, his voice entirely serious. "No," Dakota said, snapping the lid back onto the container. "I'm just a mother who actually packs a go bag." She checked her phone. The cracked screen illuminated. It was 3:15 p.m., an hour since Greg was supposed to show up. No new messages. The irritation flared again, a hot, prickly heat in her chest. She had spent $30 for this. $30 she needed for Leo's winter coat. "Your sister," Dakota said, turning her phone face down on the table. "When is she getting here?" Hayes checked his heavy matte black watch. 10 minutes. She was across town. She's bringing my driver. He looked at Dakota, hesitating. "You don't have to stay. I know you're waiting for someone." "I'm not waiting for anyone," Dakota said sharply. The admission burned, humiliating and raw. "He's not coming." Hayes looked at the empty chair across from her original table. He looked back at Dakota's tight, defensive expression. The wealthy executive in him vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense flash of anger that surprised Dakota. "He stood you up," Hayes stated. His voice was suddenly very dark, a low rumble that vibrated beneath the noise of the cafe. "People get busy," Dakota deflected, hating the defensive tone in her own voice. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want his defense. She just wanted to go home. "Busy is a text message," Hayes said softly. "Ghosting is cowardice. If a man makes a commitment to your time, he honors it. Period."
Dakota looked away, focusing on the wet rain tracking down the large cafe windows. The gray Seattle afternoon was bleeding into dusk. The warmth of the coffee shop felt suffocating suddenly. The smell of roasted beans and damp coats was overwhelming. She felt a familiar tight pressure in her throat, the repressed exhaustion of 1,000 lonely Sundays threatening to break the surface. She wasn't going to cry. Not over a man whose profile picture included a dead fish. Not in front of a billionaire who smelled like sandalwood and desperation. Before she could respond, the brass bell above the door chimed loudly. Dakota glanced up, expecting to see a harried woman who looked like Hayes rushing in to take over the quad squad. Instead, a man walked in. He was wearing a slightly damp windbreaker over a polo shirt. His hair was meticulously gelled, immovable despite the wind outside. He looked around the cafe, his eyes scanning the tables with a casual, unapologetic arrogance. He spotted Dakota's empty table,
Then his eyes locked onto her sitting with Hayes. Dakota felt the blood freeze in her veins. It was Greg. He hadn't ghosted. He was just an hour and 15 minutes late. And he was walking straight toward them. Greg stopped at the edge of their table, his hands jammed into the pockets of his khakis. He looked at the paper napkins, the spilled sugar on Hayes' trousers, the 4 toddlers smearing pastry crumbs across the table, and finally at Dakota. His lip curled. It was a subtle, ugly movement. "Dakota, right?" Greg asked, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded irritated. "I texted you I was running behind. Did you not check your phone?" Dakota stared at him. She thought about the single message she had sent at 2:30. Read 2:32 p.m. No reply. "You didn't text me, Greg," Dakota said, her voice dropping into a flat, calm register. It was the voice she used when a situation was turning volatile, cold, detached. Greg scoffed, pulling one hand out of his pocket to wave dismissively at the mess in front of her. "Whatever. I got held up. My buddy needed a jump start. I figured you'd wait." He looked at Hayes, taking in the ruined suit and the exhaustion. Then he looked back at Dakota, his eyes raking over her thrift store blouse. He let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. "I didn't realize you brought your boss's kids on our date. Your profile said you only had one." Dakota felt a physical jolt in her stomach. He thought she was a nanny. He looked at her, saw a woman surrounded by screaming children, saw a man in a bespoke suit beside her, and made the immediate cynical calculation that she was hired help. Hayes went perfectly, dangerously still. The frantic, exhausted father vanished instantly. The man who sat beside Dakota now was the apex predator who dismantled corporations for sport. He slowly wiped a smear of chocolate off his thumb with a napkin. "Excuse me?" Hayes said quietly. "I'm just saying," Greg continued, oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere, leaning against the empty chair. "If I knew I was taking out the hired help, I wouldn't have bothered driving all the way downtown. I don't do drama, and I definitely don't do other people's baggage." Dakota didn't flush. She didn't shrink. She felt the heavy, familiar weight of her past life settle over her shoulders. She stood up. She didn't move fast, but she moved with undeniable purpose. She stepped around the table, putting herself directly in Greg's personal space. He was a few inches taller than her, but as she squared her shoulders, looking him dead in the eye, he instinctively took a half step backward. "My time," Dakota said, her voice quiet, steady, and terrifyingly cold, "is worth significantly more than whatever pathetic excuse you just fabricated. You are an hour and 15 minutes late. You lied about texting me, and you just insulted a man who has more integrity in his ruined suit jacket than you possess in your entire existence." Greg blinked, his arrogant smirk faltering. "Whoa, relax." "Do not tell me to relax," Dakota cut in, her tone slicing through the cafe air like a razor. "You walked in here assuming you held the power because you kept me waiting. You miscalculated. Turn around, walk out the door. Do not ever contact me again." Greg's face flushed dark red. The public humiliation was settling in. The cafe had gone dead silent again. He puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his ego. "You're crazy, you know that? You're just another bitter single mom who—" "Sir," the word wasn't spoken by Dakota, and it wasn't spoken by Hayes. It came from directly behind Greg. Greg whipped around. 2 men had entered the cafe silently. They were wearing dark, tailored suits, but they didn't move like businessmen. They moved like reinforced concrete. Their eyes constantly scanned the room, The man who had spoken stepped forward. He had short graying hair, a thick neck, and the unmistakable posture of private security. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on Greg's shoulder. It didn't look like a polite touch. It looked like a clamp. "I believe the lady asked you to leave," the security man said, his voice a low gravel. Greg looked at the size of the man's hand on his shoulder. The fight drained out of him instantly. He swallowed hard, muttered something incoherent under his breath, and practically bolted for the door, the brass bell clattering wildly in his wake. Dakota let out a long breath, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving her bones feeling hollow. The security man turned away from the door. He looked at Hayes, giving a short nod. "Mr. Hayes, the car's out front. Your sister is in the vehicle." "Thanks, Miller," Hayes said, standing up. He looked exhausted, but the panic in his eyes was gone. Miller stepped forward to help gather the children. As he reached past Dakota to grab the stroller handle, he paused. He looked at Dakota, his brow furrowing. He looked at her posture, the way she had naturally boxed Greg into the corner, the way her eyes automatically tracked the cafe exits. Miller's eyes widened slightly. He straightened up, dropping his hand from the stroller. "Captain?" Miller said, his voice entirely devoid of its previous gravelly threat. It was laced with pure shock. Dakota froze. She looked at Miller's face, searching the older man's features. It took her a second, peeling back a decade of age and gray hair, but she recognized the harsh lines of his jaw. Staff Sergeant Miller, Kabul, 2015. "Miller," Dakota said softly, a tired smile touching the corners of her mouth. "It's been a long time. It's just Dakota now." Miller didn't relax. He actually stood taller, a reflex ingrained in his muscles. "You ran the logistics detail for the 75th, ma'am. You pulled my squad out of the Helmand Province clusterfuck when command cut our transport. I didn't know you got out." "I had a son," Dakota said simply, gesturing vaguely to her tote bag. Priority shifted. Hayes was standing perfectly still, staring at Dakota. He looked at Miller, then back at the woman in the wrinkled thrift store blouse, who had just neutralized 4 toddlers and a hostile ex-date with equal terrifying precision. "Captain," Hayes repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "Former," Dakota corrected sharply. She picked up her heavy tote bag, slinging it over her shoulder. She looked at Hayes. The vulnerability in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, intense fascination. "Thank you," Hayes said. It wasn't about the coffee or the pacifier. It was about everything. I don't even have your phone number." Dakota looked at the billionaire, his suit ruined, his children finally quiet in the presence of Miller's imposing authority. She smiled. It was the first real, genuine smile she had felt all day. It reached her eyes, crinkling the exhausted skin at the corners. "Secure your perimeter, Hayes," Dakota said, turning toward the door. "If you can manage that, maybe you can find me." She walked out of the cafe, stepping into the freezing, rain-swept streets of Seattle. The cold air hit her face, crisp and clean. She checked her pocket. She still had $30. It was time to go home. If you love this story of unexpected connections, hidden paths, and chaotic coffee shop encounters, don't forget to hit that like button. We release raw, grounded, and thrilling audio dramas just like this one every single week. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a fiercely independent protagonist, and make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us keep creating these stories. Drop a quick comment below with your favorite moment.